The following podcast was recorded on Friday, August 19th, 2022, featuring Sam Rines of Arbor Data Science. To hear the podcast in real time, you can sign up for a free trial at arborresearch.com or by emailing Gus Handler directly at gus.handler@arborresearch.com. You can also call Arbor Research and Trading at 1-800-606-1872. Thanks for your time and enjoy the podcast. Welcome everyone to the latest edition of Talking Data. I'm your host, Kristen Radosh with Arbor Research and Trading, joined today by our commentator, Sam Rines of Arbor Data Science. Welcome, Sam.
Hey, good morning, Kristen.
Today, Sam answers the question, where's the rain? Sam, 70% of the U.S. has been abnormally dry and 40% is in a severe drought. There's many inputs in the commodity that we take for granted, but today we want to focus on the critical role of water. What's the current status in the U.S.?
Oh, it's a complete mess. When you look at call it a 2 to 3 year kind of time horizon, the U.S. has been in vast swaths of the U.S. has at least been in a mild drought, if not a significant drought or acute drought, depending on what you want to call it, for quite a while. I mean, this has not been something that has been alleviated or we've had a break from. It's just kind of been a little bit of a creeping issue, and it could continue to be an issue to a large extent. We hear a lot about what's going on with energy, what's going on with agriculture, but we don't really pay attention as much as I think we should in many cases to things like water. Right? I mean, there's only, a couple of things that humans need to live, and one of them happens to be water. And there's only a few things that you need to grow food, and one of them happens to be water. So I think it's a far more interesting issue to kind of dig into than people are giving it credit for.
And what's the impact on the critical agricultural areas?
Oh, it's severe, right? It's most of the Midwest is at least in some form of drought. Texas, and Texas grows a lot of rice, a lot of wheat, a lot of cotton. So it's a pretty significant issue, particularly when you're looking at the longer term implications for a broad range of goods, right? If you have a bad cotton crop, it's going to filter through to the cost of clothes. These aren't things that just kind of mysteriously grow. You have to have the water, and the water has to be in the correct places. There's been a lot of kind of chat about what's going on with the rivers in particularly Germany, where they're so low that you can't ship a lot of things. There's a number of reasons and a number of ways that a lack of water can really play into a much broader issue. So if you were to have a significant drought that persisted in, call it the Mississippi basin, you could begin to have problems for shipping up and down the Mississippi. Now that's not happening and probably won't happen, but it's not inconceivable that you could begin to have these issues come up for the U.S. as well. Recently, we saw that there will be cuts to the water supply of a lot of the southeastern U.S. states because there simply isn't enough water in the West. So again, these issues kind of seem a little, call it esoteric, but they're really beginning to come to the fore.
And looking again, if we talk about the global front, what is the significance of the drought season, given we already have the stress with the Ukraine invasion? So if we look at global food commodity markets, what is that stress like?
So it's interesting. It would be a bigger issue if you were seeing droughts, call it in South America, things like that, where they're currently in their prime growing season. The U.S. is in its prime growing season as well. But it would be a much larger issue if it were spreading to South America. Recently, we've seen an uptick in the amount of wheat coming out of Russia, for instance. We've seen a little bit of trickle out of Ukraine, and much more than we anticipated coming out of Ukraine. So that's kind of alleviating some of the pressure on global food. Brazil, for instance, is call it putting 70 million more tons of corn potentially on the market, corn and wheat on the market, just generally grains. Think of it as 70 million extra tons of grains on the market than it was 2 or 3 years ago. That's a pretty significant global increase. So you're getting some alleviation because of South America and South America's growing conditions. But if the drought were to call it not be U.S. and Western Europe focused, it would be a much bigger issue for the global commodity price. Luckily, we've begun to see at least some good news coming out of Ukraine and Russia on the food front. So I would say you might actually have call it some positive news on the food inflation front, at least in the near term, until we begin to go into 2023. That's when this could become a little bit of an issue for the global supply.
And what happens, for instance, we're not experiencing a drought, but instead are looking at flooding conditions? What happens across to the country? Do we have the infrastructure to handle that?
Yeah, this is what I like to call rain in all the wrong places. It does rain, and being in Houston, we see it rain quite a bit. And every time you get a thunderstorm, it seems that there's at least a little bit of road flooding. There's a lack of infrastructure generally within call it the U.S. population centers to handle significant amounts of water in a short period of time. We saw it, or over a long period of time. We saw it with Hurricane Harvey in Houston, and with significant road flooding that persisted for a very, very long time. We've seen it in New York when they have flash floods. It's a very significant issue for subways. It's transportation in general. So there is a lack of infrastructure to handle significant amounts of rain and water, not just in, call it Texas or in New York, but generally in population centers around the U.S.
So is water-related resource management a priority? Is it going to be a priority?
That's interesting. It's not as big of a priority as it should be, right? There should be a priority of getting water from the places that don't need it and have it to the places that really need it, particularly agricultural areas. That to me is something that's lacking, but it is beginning to become much more of a talking point, I think, for politicians. And that's really the only way to do this, right? Most of the water infrastructure that we would need to build would need to be on the public side, right? It's very difficult to have a private organization, unless you're in Texas, of course, build a lot of the water supply and build a lot of the gutters and drainage systems that we would need to actually have, the pipelines, that type of deal. So it would mean there needs to be much more of a public investment in it. And right now it's much more of a focus on the energy front for obvious reasons, and probably good reasons, but a much more diversified thinking around water should be a priority as we move forward, because we kind of need it.
You have a chart that we'd like to bring up and highlight here. It focuses in on the performance of water ETFs.
Yes, and most of these are related to infrastructure, right? These are infrastructure plays. And infrastructure generally over the past year just hasn't been the place to be. There's been a significant amount of, call it, rotation away from some of these names, but you are beginning to see some interest relative to the S&P and some performance, and you're beginning to see a bounce back, et cetera. But you simply haven't had the tailwinds of government, bill that's going to spend a significant amount of money on water. So it's been lacking. And until you really begin to see the government step in with significant spending bills, making it a priority, it's going to be very difficult to see these ETFs and broadly water ETFs, water-related names, begin to move in a meaningful way.
Sam, in summary today, what should we be looking for next?
It's interesting. This is related, but somewhat not related, but I think it's an interesting thought experiment to go through, that one of the easiest ways to do a cyber attack in the United States would be to go after a water processing plant in a major city that pollutes the water system, it makes the water undrinkable, and et cetera. So I think one of the ways to kind of think about playing the water space would be to think about looking into cybersecurity names that really specialize in securing that critical infrastructure when there's the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine is, guess what? It's a largely cyber dominant conflict. So I think you're going to continue to see cyber attacks, and there could be some cyber attacks against the grid, but also against related water infrastructure that gets overlooked frequently. So I would say maybe it's time to play it from that direction and think about it there. So I'll be watching pretty closely to see if there's any sort of movement towards really putting some critical infrastructure under a cybersecurity type of mandate from the government, in kind of not necessarily in replacement to creating a better and more reliable water system, but kind of shoring up what we already have.
Well, Sam, thank you for your thoughts today, and thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, you can contact Gus Handler at gus.handler@arborresearch.com. Thanks again, and have a great day.